Do you have a solid game plan of how you're going to actually get paid working with a buyer come July of this year? What is going on, guys? My name is Chris Elliott with the Elliot Real Estate Team based out of Richmond, Virginia. So we talked about a couple weeks ago, we did a video of how myself, my team plans to explain buyer brokerage compensation. We got a lot of traction on that video. Seems like a topic that a lot of folks are talking about, obviously given the changes coming down the pipe. So what I want to share with you guys in this video is a graphic that we had created. Feel free, take it, steal it, rip it off, duplicate it, change it to your colors, of how we plan to explain to buyers how we actually get compensated for our services. My broker has approved it, so I feel confident that we're good to go. Certainly have your broker look it over and make sure that they feel it's compliant and that it says all the right things and that you're not going to end up in real estate jail. But anyway, so let me share this with you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to role play this in this video as if you were a buyer on the buyer consultation. And I'm just going to go through, as if we're going through the buyer brokerage agreement, which we all need to get signed, right? Once we get to the compensation part, so the first question I always like to ask or plan to ask is, hey, this next section of the agreement talks about how we get compensated for our services in helping you find a home. Hey, let me ask you, there's been a lot in the news about the changes coming down to the real estate market with the NAR settlement and whatnot. What, if anything, have you heard? What is your understanding? So first and foremost, I want to address the elephant in the room, right? I don't want to just try to brush over this. I want to address the elephant in the room, and I want to ask them, hey, what all is your understanding? What have you heard? And I want to ask them to explain for two reasons. Number one, I want to find out what they actually know or think they know or understand, just so I know kind of like how much they know or don't know and where we need to start. I also like to make people explain to me what they actually understand and what they know, because once you do that, you kind of force most people to realize they really don't know much of anything. Well, I just kind of saw a headline, or you ask people to explain something if they don't really know much about it. It becomes very apparent when they start talking that they kind of realize themselves like, oh, I really don't know too much about this topic, right? I just kind of saw a headline or whatever. So that's the place that I want to start. And then I'll listen to whatever they say, right? I'll listen intently, I'll affirm, I'll ask questions, I'll clarify. And then once I have a good understanding of kind of where they're at, I'll say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, do you mind if I take a second to explain um, uh, kind of the different options of how we can be compensated for our services? Sure, Chris, go ahead, right? And then I'm going to bust out this graphic, which I will share with you now. All right. So, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, these are the different options in which we can get compensated for our services. So just to establish kind of simple here, right? So we've got myself over here as the buyer agent. We have you as the client, and we're going to be rendering service to you in the form of helping you find a home and obviously navigating that transaction, negotiating, protecting all the stuff that you do, and that's a separate video, right? But for that service, we're going to be charging a fee, and you're going to be responsible for paying that fee, right? Well, Chris, do you mean that has to come out of pocket? Well, we'll talk about that, where the money is actually going to come from. But does that kind of relationship make sense? That like I'm going to render service, you're going to be responsible for our fee. This is every service relationship since the beginning of time. Like if I have a plumber coming out, they're going to come out and do plumbing stuff. And for that plumbing stuff, I'm going to pay them a fee. Yes, that makes sense. Okay, cool. So as far as where that money actually comes from, or how that fee gets paid, there's multiple different options, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. And there's three options that we're going to see displayed on the MLS. Three potential options we're going to see displayed on the MLS for every single property. Do you mind if I explain this to you? Yeah, sure, go ahead. Cool. All right, so the first option is that the seller could be offering concessions that completely cover the fee. So, this is where you state whatever you charge, or hopefully at that point you've already charged it. So on our team, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller or Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, so the fee that we charge to help you find a home is 3% of the purchase price of whatever home that you purchase. So if the seller is offering concessions, which is going to be a dollar amount, don't worry, I'll help you do that math, right? So on a $300,000 home, if they are offering a $9,000 concession amount, that concession amount will fully cover our entire fee. Does that make sense? Yes. Cool. So in that scenario, the seller's offered concessions that completely cover our fee. The next option that we're going to potentially see is that the seller is offering concessions that partially cover the fee. So for example, if they're offering $4,500, that would potentially cover half the fee. Well, Chris, does that mean we're going to have to make up the other half? Potentially, we actually have some more options. But if I may, let me just finish this section. Cool. All right. So the next option that we're going to see displayed in the MLS is that the seller offers no concessions, meaning they are not offering any concessions, and therefore none of that fee would be covered by what's actually, or they're not offering to cover anything. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we're going to know this on every single property before you even go see the property, because this is going to be a field in the MLS that's going to be displayed as to what, if any, concessions that are being offered. Does that make sense? Yeah, we're tracking. Okay. So that actually leaves us with 5 different options when making an offer. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, once again, you're going to know up front before we even go see the property. I'm going to make you aware of what the concessions are as far as what they're offering, right? So we have 5 options when making an offer to actually cover that fee. Can I go through this with you? Great. Yes. Awesome. So the first one is, if the seller is offering concessions that entirely cover the fee, those offered concessions cover the fee. And in that scenario, you are not responsible for any of our fee. The concessions that are being offered can be used to completely cover that fee. Would that pose any problem to you? No. Yeah, if that money's coming out, then that's fine. These next 2 options are what we can do if the offered concessions partially cover our fee. So the first is we can negotiate the remainder of the fee into the purchase contract. So let's say they're only offering $4,500. We can just say, hey, that's great. However, we're willing to make you an offer for a $9,000 concession. And if they agree to that, then that happens right there, and our fee gets covered by the seller. Would that be okay? Yeah, that'd be okay. Okay. So the next option, if they are offering concessions that partially cover the fee, is that you could just agree to pay the remainder of the fee at closing. So we just say, hey, we're going to handle the remainder of the fee outside of the purchase contract. Maybe it's a competitive situation. No matter what the scenario is, if you decide, hey, I want to buy this house, and going into it, and when you make the offer that part of our fee is only partially covered, you could just pay the remainder of the fee at closing. Would that be an issue for you? Well, it depends on how much that fee is. Okay, fair enough. I mean, obviously, we're going to know before we go see the property what those concessions are, and certainly when we make an offer, we're going to know what we are and are not agreeing to, and therefore you're never going to find yourself in a scenario where you're owing money that you didn't know up front. Okay. So maybe we say that's a maybe situation, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Yeah, it's a maybe. I guess it depends on what it is. Okay, fair enough. So if the next 2 options are if the seller is offering no concessions. So if they're not offering any concessions in the multiple listing service, once again, we can negotiate the entire fee or part of the fee into the purchase agreement and just make it a condition of our offer. Would that scenario work for you? Well, if we can negotiate the whole fee, yeah, that would work for us. Okay, cool. Last option is that the client pays the entire fee at closing, meaning like if the seller is offering no concessions, and let's just say it's a competitive situation or whatever, they're just not willing to budge, and you guys want to buy the house, then you would just pay our entire fee at closing, in addition to your closing costs and expenses and whatnot. Would that scenario work for you? Well, no, Chris, I don't think we can afford that. Okay, not a problem. So that still leaves us with 4 potential scenarios that would work for you, correct? Because if they are covering our fee, if we can negotiate our fee into the purchase agreement, or potentially if you had to pay part of our fee, depending on how big that number would be, those 4 scenarios would work for you. Yeah, actually, those would work for us. Okay, cool. So let me ask you this, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. If a seller is not offering any concessions in the multiple listing service, and I call the listing agent and find out like they're just not willing to budge, they're just not going to entertain paying any of our, or our fee or all of our fee. Do you even want to go see those properties? Well, I don't know. I don't think it would make sense to. Cool. So why don't we just agree that we're not going to see any properties that fall into this bucket, but that we'll look at all 4 properties that fall into these 4 buckets right here, right? So end of role play. So obviously, if you are going to, or maybe not obviously, if you're going to do something like that, I would highly encourage you to get that reduced down to writing in your buyer brokerage agreement. I'm not a broker. I'm not giving you legal advice, or I shouldn't even say that. That's what we plan to do, right? But I would encourage you guys, if you haven't already, get some sort of graphic, get some sort of infographic, something professionally edited that you can walk through this process with people, give them the options, show them what the options are going to be. Because if you just leave it at uncertainty of like, well, hey, I don't know how this is going to go, we'll see, or this is what I think we can do, blah, blah, blah. I think you're going to scare a lot of buyers away that just assume the worst of, hey, we're going to end up having to pay your fee at closing. My only other advice to you that I'll leave you with is practice, practice, practice this conversation, because I promise you, you don't want to be having this conversation for the first time in July when it actually counts. And the agents that are able to confidently, concisely, professionally have this conversation are the folks that are going to be winning post July of this year. So hope this helps. Happy hunting. If you have questions, concerns, shoot me a DM. Look forward to seeing you next week.